unfair expectations of anyone. So let me give you the description of a perfect pastor. The perfect pastor preaches like Billy Graham, counsels like Dr. Phil, leads like a CEO, and prays like the Apostle Paul. He is young enough to have endless energy and old enough to have decades of wisdom, and available enough to never miss a call day or night. He visits every shut-in. He attends every meeting. He shows up at every ball game, and he still manages to spend hours in the study preparing sermons that are short, deep, and unforgettable. He is strong but not intimidating, humble but not timid, funny but never silly, serious but never dull. And of course, his wife plays the piano. His kids are perfect, and he never gets tired. In other words, a perfect pastor exists somewhere else, not in our church. Now, one form or another of this little ditty has been going around for decades, because a lot of times we don't really understand what we expect of one another. But having said that, the pastor does need to take care about his personal life. Very much so, in fact. And there are some things that I don't do really because of you. It's not that I inherently shouldn't do them, but I don't do them because I'm a pastor. That if I was in your chair, I would do them. But from my chair, from my place, I feel like it's best that I not. So I limit my liberty, you might say, because of my role as a pastor. And I have never regretted that. But I'm saying that's one of the realities of being in pastoral work. And, if you don't want eyes on you, don't be in it. If you don't realize that there's going to be people who analyze everything that you say, even if you say something really wise, like a tin-horn translator could not buy Greek with a hamburger, which is what I said Sunday morning, instead of saying a hamburger in Greek. But, by the way, just to encourage us all, that I'm not the only pastor that says weird stuff. This lady who makes the reels, that made us this free reel this week, the one that you might see, she told the story about her pastor. Man, I was greatly encouraged. She said, I had to edit out something really bad my pastor said this Sunday. Buddy, I said, you got my attention now. She said, my pastor got up and said, God is not reliable. God is not reliable. Well, he didn't mean to say that, but he said it anyway. So she said, I had to go in. It was a great little sentence or two that he said, but I had to cut that out. I wish somebody would cut out some of the stuff that I've said and put it back with it cut out. Now, Timothy was a pastor. And this book was originally penned really to Timothy and then to all of us who do what we do. And if you do what we do, you're going to be watched, you're going to be analyzed, you're going to be, I don't know what all you kind of words you'd put on it, but I'm just saying it comes with the territory. So if you can't deal with it, don't be a pastor. Now it says here that Timothy is not to let anybody despise his youth. Let no man despise thy youth. Well, the implication is he was a young pastor in age, but I thought, that's probably right, but it could also mean he was just new at pastoring. Because I'm going to tell you that, and this is more than conventional wisdom, this is reality, that if I went somewhere at 67 years of age and took another church, I would be the new pastor. And though I have much experience, they might disesteem me as pastor because I just got there. And it might be that Timothy, just as much as being a young man with years, might face a challenge in his church of them following him as the leader. Might also have faced the same problem just being a new pastor. And if you're a young new pastor, then you've got two places that can cause you trouble. But let me say this. It says, let no man despise thy youth. I'll remind you, and I have no plans of dying. But I will say this, if you ask me how I'm doing, I'll say I'm okay as far as I know. You get my age, you have to throw a little kicker in there, so if I drop dead, you won't think I lied to you. I would say this, that if I drop dead and you call another pastor, that pastor should be completely qualified. You don't just say, which Bible version do you use? How many times have you been married? Oh, we like your preaching, you're in. No, there is a long list of qualifications. And why does that matter? I'll tell you one reason why. Because the minute he is voted in, he is the pastor. He is not the almost pastor. He is not the will be the pastor in 5 years pastor. He's a pastor that moment. Just like a man who gets married to a wife, the minute you say, I do, guess what? You're the head of that home. That's why you better be careful, gals, who you marry. And don't try to force him to grow into the job. Make sure he already is grown into the job before you put the ring on your finger. Because the very moment you marry him, he's the head of your home. Now, Timothy is basically being allowed or being told not to let people despise his leadership and not let people kind of push him around and deny his role as leader and pastor because he's young or new. I can remember my good friend John Cross, who I sold cars with. He was maybe the single greatest reason I got in church years ago. And John was a youth pastor at our church, and he was a used car salesman, rich, and he was a pretty good salesman. Not as good as you, but he's pretty good. And so he invited me to church, and I went there. And later on, he went to pastor in Florida. I believe he's in Naples. He's still there. And he told me, he said, Brian, when I got there, the church was, an older church and very well established and very structured. And my first Monday morning on the job after preaching on Sunday, I went in to make some copies, and the church secretary stopped me and said, you're not allowed to make copies. And he said, yes, but I'm the pastor. She said, doesn't matter. You don't have permission to make copies. Now, I have to say, I don't know exactly what happened there. But he's still there. So he must have been wise enough to be patient. But he shouldn't have had to be patient. Because that first Monday morning, guess what? He's the pastor. She answers to him, not him to her. I can remember Brother Smith, who is not here tonight, Dr. R.G. We were talking about new churches and new pastors, and he said his first church that he went to, one of his men said, I want to talk to you about some things you're not doing right. And came to his house and had a piece of paper upon which 48 things were written. It would have been a much quicker discussion to say what he was doing right. It would have been short, because apparently he wasn't doing anything right. And he hadn't been there too long, and the guy read him all 48, and God bless him, Brother Smith was very kind and just listened and said, well, I'll try to do better, And that was the same church where Brother Smith was out of town one day. And the ladies, the sweet Baptist ladies of the church, came to their home and surrounded his home like Indians and beat on the windows and demanded that Miss Teresa come outside because some of those good choir ladies wanted to fight her. Wonderful Baptist Christian people. Guess what? That's out there. It comes with the territory, unfortunately. Now, what God told Timothy was, in so many words, he said, now look, you're the pastor, but don't go in there flaunting your authority as a young man. Instead, he said, be thou an example of the believers. Now, I want you to notice it says, be an example of the believers, not to the believers. Have you ever noticed that? The meaning is this. He's telling Timothy, don't set out to show everybody what a good Christian you are, hoping they will follow you. Set out to be a good Christian. Be a sample size of what a Christian should be. Be a good example for example's sake, not that you're trying to be a good example to someone else. I'll say this, and when somebody tells their young person, do right because you can be a good example to the other young people. Well, okay, on one level I like that, but on another level, if you're not careful, that might smack a little bit of superiority. Because you're already saying you're better than they are in some way. I think that's okay. I don't judge anyone's heart, but I would say it's better to say, be a good example of the believers. In other words, you just be the best Christian you can be because it's right to be the best Christian you can be. And don't set out to be the great leader of the church as far as being an example. No, work on the guy that you shave every day. Work on the guy that's in the mirror. Instead of setting out to be some great example to them, just be a good example of the faith. The word example here means, it comes from the Greek word typos. It means a pattern. And Jasmine here is a great seamstress. And I guess you still use patterns at times to make clothing. It wouldn't matter if I had a pattern, it wouldn't turn out. But it is mighty convenient and saves a lot of time and makes something more repeatable, if you have a pattern to go after. So what he was saying to Timothy is, look, strive to live in such a way that you're a good Christian. Not a perfect Christian. There are no such. Not a perfect Christian, but a good Christian. Try to be a good example of what it means to be a good Christian. And then it says, in word. Be thou an example of the believers in word. All right, that means in matters of speech. See, every word that a pastor says is subject to being analyzed, especially when you're online, and could be taken issue with, or could be corrected, and maybe it needs to be corrected at times, and may be criticized. But that, again, comes with the territory. We're working on our next T-shirt of all the weird stuff that I've said since the last T-shirt. And most of them are mistakes that I have made, like ordering a hamburger in Greek, or a blind nut finding a squirrel, or something like that. But really what this is talking about when it says in word, is talking about a pastor should use appropriate language. In other words, a pastor should not use foul language. A pastor should not use, now look, you guys are not new here. I don't think we have anybody here that's never been here before. I like humor. I'm not a big joke teller per se, but I like humor. But I never use off-color humor. I never use sensual humor. I would never tell a raunchy joke or make raunchy talk in person, much less in a group. We should not be rude or harsh in private conversation, or flirty or gossipy or critical or dishonest. A pastor should be a good example in word. Now, I work on things, and sometimes I'm successful and sometimes I'm not. There's some words I say that I want to stop saying. They're not bad words, but they're words I prefer not to say in public, especially because some people don't enjoy them, and I try not to do that. But sometimes I fail anyway, and they just come out. Now you're wondering which one it is, and I'll tell you for $5 after service. But James chapter 1, verse 26, if any man among you seem to be religious and bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his own heart, this man's religion is vain. So the tongue is very, very important for a pastor. I had to learn a long time ago the art of saying nothing. That's why I say to you that I'm not going to give you unsolicited advice unless I see you about to jump off a cliff or something. If I hear you talking about something you're about to do, and it's a matter of preference, or it's really none of my business unless you make it my business. So I'm not going to just jump in there and say, well, here's what you should do, or here's what you shouldn't do. If you want to know my opinion, ask me. If you don't, I'm probably not going to share it with you unless it's something really terrible. Like if you said, I'm going to kill my husband, I'd say, well, let's talk about that. He deserves it, but wait. So, in word. And then look here. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word. And then it says in what? In conversation. Now, we use the word conversation to talk about talking. But the Bible word for conversation means your manner of living, which of course includes talking. So, it is the way of life. Paul said in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 13, for ye have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it. So the pastor should have a way of life that is a good conversation, a good way of living. He can't be perfect, but he has to be someone of good character. He has to be someone of good behavior. And again, all these qualifications that are given in this book, the vast majority of them refer to a pastor's conversation as in his manner of living, not his skill as a preacher or his great skill as a counselor, or even his Bible knowledge. While you're not to be a novice and you should be apt to teach, but, look, I have known and been around some of the most successful pastors of the last 40 or 50 years. I have known some that were incredible pulpiteers. I have known some very successful pastors who were not. I have heard guys preach, and I would say, that was not real, Like I taught in the preacher-teacher class today, I said, one thing I never want to hear about my preaching or teaching is this: when it's over, I don't want you to leave and say, what was that about? And I've heard many sermons where the guy said something good here and there along the way, but when it's over, you think, well, now really, what was that about? There needs to be some clarity. I think tonight, even if you hate everything that I have said, you'd have to understand this is about the pastor's personal life. And I've heard some pastors they are tremendous in their style, but their substance is not there. And I've had others that have tremendous substance, but their style is tough. They're hard to listen to. And I have seen both kinds pastor great churches. I mean, I'll just give you a name. The late Bobby Robertson from Walkertown, North Carolina, pastored a church of 3,500 to 4,000 people. He was just a country preacher. I've heard him preach many times. He was no Adrian Rogers, but he had a great heart, and he was a tremendous pastor, though he was not the greatest pulpiteer. He was, I would say, if I were to grade him, and who am I to grade anybody, but since y'all brought it up, I would say that as a pulpiteer, he was a B, or maybe a B minus. But as a man, he was an A plus. And as a pastor, he was an A plus. And it's much better that you be an A plus as a man and an A plus as a shepherd. You don't have to necessarily be the best preacher who ever lived. Now, if you can do both, amen. Now, the next thing here, it says, in charity. Now, the word charity, synonym is love, of course, but the word charity really means a one-way transaction. Like if you give a donation to the thrift shop or to the rescue mission or to the church, that's not an investment. You're not expecting, or should not expect, anything in return. It's a one-way thing. You're giving. And by the way, your gifts to God, your service to God should be of love, which means you expect nothing in return. So many people do a little something for God and expect a trophy from God. I don't understand that. I mean, I'm not saying I've never felt that way, but I got to tell you, that's a wrong way to feel. And if the way you feel, you won't serve God long. Because you're probably not going to get a trophy. I hadn't gotten one yet. Charity is a one-way transaction. Charity is a one-way street. Now, the pastor is to be a man of charity. What does that mean? Well, that means he loves people. He loves people. And he does not give much thought to whether or not they love him back. I will tell you, I don't spend any time wondering whether you love me. Whether you do or whether you don't is not something I think about. I give myself to making sure I love you. Because that's what I'm told to do. And I prayed today, I'll just be transparent with you. I spent about 2.5 hours in prayer today. I'm spending more time in prayer. I've got so many decisions to make. I feel like Martin Luther, who said, I've got so many things to do today, I must spend my first 3 hours in prayer. I spent about 2.5 hours in prayer today, and I always pray, God, help me to love my people as I should. And a good pastor does not put his people into debt because he loves them. Now, people are both the greatest joy and the most difficult thing about ministry. They are the source of blessing and the source of struggle all wrapped up into one package. Because, like I told some pastor not too long ago who was kind of complaining about his people, I said, well, if they were like they ought to be, they wouldn't need you. That's kind of your job, to help them not be like they tend to be. You're a shepherd. And if you're going to help them, you've got to love them. For example, a pastor must give money away to pay the bills of someone this week who he knows criticized him last week. He does that out of charity, out of love. A pastor shows mercy to the wayward children of his members when those same members had no mercy on his kids when they just wobbled a little bit. A pastor has to help one up who has fallen, who tried to push him down last month. So if a pastor doesn't love people, fallen, sinful, wayward, frail, weak people, he will not do this long. And this is such a thing with pastors that there is a giant list of quotes from some of the best pastors ever reflecting this reality that people are the best thing and the worst thing about ministry. I mentioned the great Adrian Rogers, and he was a great preacher. I listen to him still. And I love to hear him. He's been in heaven for a while, but he said, the ministry is the greatest privilege on earth, but remember, people will break your heart. We sing Amazing Grace at our church quite often, great song. The author of that song, John Newton, who was a slave trader who got saved, later became a great Christian and pastor, he said, the Christian ministry is a weighty and difficult service, and the chief trials arise from dealing with people. So if you don't love people, you won't do it long. If you are not a lover of good men and a lover of hospitality, which means you enjoy people, you love people and you also enjoy people. Martin Luther said, wherever God builds a church, the devil builds a chapel. And he usually builds that chapel out of people. In other words, the faithful opposition. A.W. Tozer said the pastor's heart is often torn between the love for his people and the pain that they cause him. Warren Wiersbe said the ministry is made up of people. If you don't love people, you will not last long. And I have to say amen. God said, love your enemies. That sounds hard enough, and then you find out that most of the enemies he was talking about are friends of yours. And that's why God commands the pastor, be a lover of good men. Be a lover of hospitality. A pastor must love people, enjoy people, because the ministry is not these sheetrock walls. The ministry is not our buses, but the young people who ride in them. Back when we had a Spanish department, they wore this building out. I had a steady complaint of people coming to fuss about the Spanish. And I sympathize with you. You were right. But I loved them. Now, should they have done better? Of course. But I couldn't help but love them still. Just like I love you when you make a mess. And I don't say that being facetious. If you make a mess, this preacher still loves you. The ministry is not just promotions and property management, not even preaching. It is greatly in preaching. But this is, you're preaching to people to try to help them. Speaking the truth in love. That's what preaching is. So the ministry can challenge one's love for people. That's why God tells the preacher, don't you forget something. You have got to be a lover of good men. You've got to have charity. It is a one-way transaction. Look with me, if you will, at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And the Apostle Paul knew exactly what I'm talking about. And to deny this truth is to deny reality, I believe. He said this, 2 Corinthians 12:15, Paul said, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for you. In other words, I'm going to give you my days. I'm going to give you my life. I'm going to spend my time trying to serve and love you. And then he says, though, the more abundantly I love you, the less I be loved. Now that's the hard math of the ministry. And so sometimes a pastor will get hard in his heart, and he will decide, I'll never get close to anybody else ever again. I'll stop loving them. To me, it's just a job now. That's no way to be. I would suggest that no matter how many times the sheep disappoint a shepherd, he still loves sheep. And the day that a pastor stops loving sheep, he needs to do something else. Amen. Or get right with God, at least. And then it says in spirit. A good example in spirit. Let me just go backwards a little bit. All right? Do you know why I preach so? Look, preaching about love is the hardest thing you'll ever preach in a church. I mean, it is a sharp-edged sword. You know why? Because so many people just struggle with it. Loving each other. You see, I don't fuss about love because I don't love you or that I wonder if you love me. I talk about it because I wonder if you love each other. And that's what makes a church a family, is that love, you see. That brotherly love. Now, it says in spirit. Be a good example in spirit. That means mental disposition, attitude. I've mentioned several times recently the word attitude. Likely referring to Timothy's inner zeal, attitude, devotion. So a leader must have a somewhat fervent spirit. He must be interested. He must care. But he can't be one who's angry, have an angry spirit, one who's jealous or lazy or discouraged. I must tell you, it may happen soon, but I have never been one of those, and I hear about guys, and I feel for them. I've never been one of those that throws in the towel every Monday morning. I love what I do. I like what I do too. And you know, I don't like going to war. I don't like having battles. I don't like going through storms. But there's something in me that loves what I do. And I don't like drama. I don't like challenges. I don't like to struggle. But there's something in me that loves what I do. And so I have never really, that I can remember, just have the habit of every Monday morning I want to quit. Now, there's some things that I'd like to quit doing in my own character. I'd like to do better. But I don't resign every Sunday night on the way home from church. I try to have look, why do you think that there's some humor in my preaching? That's not accidental. It's not something that happens by accident. I'm happy. I have a happy spirit. And though I may chew you out in a sermon, I'm happy on the inside. I'm happy to let you have it. No, I'm happy. I've got the joy down in my heart. And I just wonder where it is in some people. I just think, are you really saved when all I ever see is a sourpuss face? What in the world is wrong with some people? And some of them are preachers. I had a preacher friend. He's no longer in the ministry, and I guess maybe it's good. Well, for sure good now, but at the time maybe it was good that he left the ministry. But He would call me about once every 3 or 4 months, and he would say, I'm gonna resign, I'm going to quit. Things aren't going well at the church. And I would say, well, you shouldn't quit. You should stay with it. And just don't quit. It takes time. His church, I spoke for him. I believe I spoke there once. I think I did. He was running 20. Well, that's tough. That's hard. You know, you prepare all week, sometimes many hours. You know, folks don't realize how long it takes to prepare 4 sermons a week. Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. That's many hours. That's not 5 hours, 10 hours. That's 35, 40 hours worth of preparation. About 10 hours a pop. And to do that for 20 people, it takes some grit to keep that up for a long time, because it can be discouraging. And I told him, I said, don't quit on these people. They're counting on you. And he finally said this after he had told me that about 10 different times, and I talked to him out of quitting. He said, well, my problem is I just can't attract any committed people to my church. I said, well, I can tell you why if you let me. I said, why would God lead a committed family to join the church of an uncommitted pastor? And knowing that you might just walk off and leave them at any moment. Well, he finally did, and that church folded. He left the ministry and his wife. Spirit, a good attitude is important. And then a man of faith, a pastor has to be a man who believes God can. And then, I'm about out of time, in purity, moral integrity. Can't be someone that's edgy and sketchy in his morals. Now, a pastor needs to model what it means to be a reasonable, good Christian. He's not sinless. He is flawed. He's frail. But he needs to be a good Christian. And just like Jasmine, who has a pattern, the Christian pastor should be a good pattern of what it means to be a believer, an example of the believers. And if you're an example of the believers, you are then also indirectly being an example to the others. My point earlier was you don't set out to say, I'll show you how to live. No, you try to walk with God, do right, be a good Christian, and you'll find that some will emulate your walk. Let's stand together. Let's pray together. And let's see here. Jose, you please dismiss our service.